The shortage unfortunately hit the automotive industry the most. How do you think the industry is doing in terms of recovery?
I mean, the roots for the shortage itself kind of go back to the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, so in 2020. And so what we saw there was that at the time when the whole world was going into a kind of a shutdown mode, as it were, the automotive industry, in particular the OEMs, took the decision to stop producing at their manufacturing plants, which is obviously in line with what was happening around the world. Unfortunately, at the same time, they also decided to stop ordering. And so by the time the automotive industry started to recover, led by China, what it found was that it had effectively taken itself out of the queue. But then as we moved into 2022 at the back end, in the second half of 2021, what we started to see was that there was a re-emergence of COVID-19 cases. And so in many countries, which host the back-end manufacturing facilities for the automotive semiconductor companies, places such as Malaysia, India, China, etc., then they were going back into a lockdown mode. And so even though the semiconductors were ready, they couldn't be packaged, they couldn't be tested, because all of those facilities were now not operating at full capacity. And so what you've seen is this kind of snowball effect, in that all of these different events have kind of snowballed and kind of increased the gap between the supply and the demand of automotive semiconductors. And it's something which unfortunately we see kind of remaining at least until the end of this year. And possibly we'll start to see some kind of a more of a sense of a recovery in 2023.
It's good to know the situation is getting better. In the meantime, is the automotive industry implementing new regulations or protocols to prevent such disturbance in the future?
I think the OEMs themselves have taken steps to make sure that they align themselves more closely with the semiconductor suppliers. So in the past, the OEMs would work with the tier ones and the tier twos, and then somewhere down the line, you had the semiconductor supplier. Now, when you kind of read or listen to the financial statements of some of the major semiconductor suppliers, is that they are getting a lot more visibility directly from the OEMs with respect to what their requirements are going to be for semiconductors moving forwards. You had perhaps Toyota as an example, because obviously they actually had semiconductor manufacturing up until a certain point in time, and then they kind of spun that out into separate companies. So they had a better understanding of complexities of the supply chain, and in addition, because of the events that they had faced from a previous tsunami in the 2010-2011 timeframe, then that had meant that they had changed their own philosophy. So they had continued to purchase material, even though the production was at a standstill. So I think people will have taken note of the philosophy that Toyota had during this time. So that is something which we should expect to see being implemented. And then, as I also say, is that the other side of it is that the OEMs are working much more directly with the semiconductor suppliers, so that they can provide the semiconductor suppliers with a true understanding of what their requirements are, and they can continue to kind of supply those requirements moving forwards.
What about management? Are we sticking with the just-in-time philosophy?
I think in general, once the supply-demand equilibrium is kind of restored, then the just-in-time philosophy kind of works well. But I do think now that the OEMs and the tier ones have a better understanding around the complexities of the supply chain, that they will take into account maybe building in additional overhead when it comes to ordering supplies, especially for the semiconductor side of things. A little bit of a side note is that we are starting to see, obviously, the implementation of different electric and electronic architectures within the vehicle. So we're moving away from this very much a distributed architecture where every domain of a vehicle, whether it be a powertrain or the chassis or the safety, every single function had its own individual ECU. And so that obviously translated into an individual demand for semiconductors for those particular ECUs. When we move towards so-called domain-based or zonal-based architectures, then you can start to virtualize some of the non-critical functions. And that way you can start to reduce some of the requirements for semiconductors. And I think that is something which we are also starting to see happening within the industry as well.